Okay, it's that retaining ring, slightly scarred, nothing to worry about, particularly rear lens groups loose. That should only be finger tight anyway. It looks like a tool's bitten into it at that point. Shims, we've got two metal shims here by the looks of it, stuck together with oil, and a paper shim. The front group, it's only bayoneted in, but looking at this, all those surfaces are corroded. You know, there's obviously corrosion damage there. Nothing fatal, but it certainly would have been better without it. And the shutter itself, there's corrosion visible on the setting lever there. Around the flash contact, around the centre here where it fits into the body, there's corrosion that I can see. Okay, we'll have the outside case off first, I think. So I'll back off this little screw that holds the flash contact wire firmly in place. 3 screws at the back of the case. Looking at the state of these, seeing if there's any obvious problems. Doesn't appear so. And the case should slide off. That's the curved rack that's driven by the shaft in the camera body. This is the curved pusher that the rack pushes, and this in turn pushes on the arm on the shutter and cocks it. This is dull and it's got a rough feel to it. That's corrosion. The housing. This is chrome brass. There's a few marks in there that may be grit, maybe corrosion. We'll have a look at that later. I'm not expecting that to be a major issue. The shutter itself. This is an early shutter. It's got the 10 blade diaphragm. That seems to move well enough, though there's obviously marks on those blades, probably oil. From the front, okay. I'll remove the lock screw. That's very easily lost. You need to take some care not to lose that. If you do lose it, there's no replacements, but you can get by locking the position of that retainer ring with the touch of lacquer in each of the 3 holes. And that's adequate. A bit better if you've still got the original part. Bit of corrosion visible down here and here, so just more evidence that the camera was splashed. The shutter speed settings cam plate, it looks pretty good. Probably the oil and grease on there has prevented any damage. A couple of spots here, it may be corrosion. Let's take out that little latch. That's the latch that prevents you from being able to release the shutter or move the shutter release if the shutter's not actually cocked. Because if you were able to press the shutter release, you would have released the film advance, and then you'd be able to wind on to the next position on the film not having taken a photo. Okay, so I've just removed that main cam. Let's remove the main spring here. See what sort of state that's in while we've got this here. Oh, it's in a pretty good state actually. That's not too tired. Take the main cam out. The self timer can come out. And the retard gear train. What's that like? That's moving fairly freely. That's good. Certainly not going to be any serious problems there. Now there's something odd about the surface here at the top. I think that's probably corrosion I'm seeing there, surface corrosion. I don't think that's going to be a serious issue. It's just another sign that this thing has had a splash and it's had moisture through it, I think. Get that screw back from there, otherwise we're going to be going nowhere. How did that get jammed in there? That was clever. That's better. The speed trains, I'll do them. They'll go in the ultrasonic cleaner and Naphtha. In here, any signs of trouble? Well, I'm not seeing any corrosion or nothing serious. Let's cock that. Yeah, things are a bit gummy. But that's just age, dried lubricants. Just recover that screw and spring. That screw. Take that plate off. Certainly some little spots of corrosion there, very, very minor. That flash contact can come off. This little component can come out that helps drive the flash sync settings system. I've got to get this spring unhooked. And I'll not want my needle nose pliers for that. I'll remove the B lever. So remove its retaining spring and screw. Remove the B lever. And remove the B lever spring. Let's see if I can get that spring loose without going away and getting the correct tool. You never know your luck in a big city. So I'll put a screwdriver behind that arm to stop it from being able to move away. Oh yeah, I was able to stretch that spring out and unhook it. That sector gear can come off, that little wheel can come off. There's a spring here, a very fine spring. I'll get that off. I'll put a toothpick over the centre so that it can't get away while I unhook the end of it. And then lift that carefully away. They're good at getting away, those springs, and that's for anything that's good at getting away. There's no spares because they've already been used up. Right, that's it for the front. 2 screws hold the settings lever direct to the moving plate in the diaphragm. Where did that other screw go? There it is. Get that back. So the setting lever comes off. Now this isn't corrosion, that is dirty old dried grease. That'll probably come off. This shim, yeah, that's just oily, which is lucky. This, however, is corrosion. Bit of corrosion around here, nothing serious. That's the setting lever for our flash sync speeds and self timer. And you can see the case. See that discoloration on the case there? That discoloration is corrosion. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. And the case comes off, and there's our shutter split. We have our diaphragm blades over here in the case. We have our shutter blades here on the back of the mechanism plate. We'll start with the diaphragm. 3 screws hold the retaining plate in place. Someone's put a scribe line across here so they'd know how to put the plate back. It was entirely unnecessary because you can see there's a hole right to it, next to it here, which obviously that needed to be lined up and couldn't go back in the wrong position. There's also an alignment pin on here, like a small dowel, which also ensures that that plate could only go back in one position. So whoever had that apart didn't know what they were doing. They were marking things that there was no need to mark. So here's our blades and the moving plate. The moving plate, it's a bit marked. It's mostly those are fingerprints. There's no serious corrosion there. And our blades, they're not even stuck together with oil. They've got oil on them, and they've certainly got scuff marks on there where those blades have scuffed over each other. But they'll clean up, I expect. The scuff marks won't go away. The case, it's pretty good. There's corrosion visible on the inside of the case at this point. That's almost certainly where the moisture got in. And at the back here you can see it, that's all discoloured. But that'll be okay. It won't, it's a little bit ugly, but it's hidden ugly and it's not going to affect the way it works. Our shutter blades, they're in quite good order. They weren't even particularly stuck together. And the mechanism plate, well, you can see there's oil here and here and here. It's seeped through from the back of the shutter. 3 screws hold the lens tube in place. This one goes through this bracket as well for the mainspring, and as a result that screw is slightly longer, perhaps 1/4 millimetre. There's not much in it, but it's important. Don't mix the screws up or you'll end up with a shutter that doesn't work, or with a hole that's stripped out. And we'll take the blade actuating ring off there, and that's the shutter stripped down now, and I can start the process of cleaning this stuff up. So normally I just start with the diaphragm, clean up the case, the retaining ring and so forth, and the blades, they'll all need to be cleaned as well. Yeah, you can see they're stuck together with oil there. So there certainly is oil in there. That's a problem with diaphragm blades, because it means that if they're stuck together and you force the setting, so typically that happens on a cold day, then the blades end up distorted because you're trying to push this end around and this end doesn't want to move, and it'll just bow up. And that's not fatal for the working of the diaphragm once it's reassembled, but it makes it exceptionally hard to get the diaphragm reassembled because the blades won't lay flat in their pivots while you're trying to get things in place if they're distorted. So best if they're not. I'll investigate this corrosion on the back here. It's more staining than anything else. As I rub the screwdriver across it, I'm not feeling lumps and bumps. I am here where the retaining ring, where this would go into the mount, but not where the control rings went on the back. But these surfaces, this surface doesn't really make much difference. It's not a working surface, if you like. But these surfaces down here where the setting levers need to work, they need to be smooth, but they don't appear to be a problem. So I'll clean this down. I'll use a bit of Brasso on there to clean those surfaces. I wouldn't normally. In the case here, I'm not feeling anything there. That'll just clean with a bit of Naphtha, I think, and that'll be as good as gold. So I'll just get those parts cleaned. Well, I've cleaned up these diaphragm parts and the case. The case cleaned up quite well. There's still a lot of marks on there. Those are stains, they're not coming out, but the metal's nice and smooth. It's ready to go. But I can start assembling this diaphragm. The blades are cleaned. The marks that are on the blades are scuff marks. They're where the blades have rubbed over each other. And the black surface finish is gone. Now obviously that's not coming back. But the blades are clean and they look to be pretty flat. So I'm not expecting any great problems assembling this. Those scuff marks, well, typically in the past I've met with those on shutters where the diaphragm has been very oily, and it's probably been very oily for a long time. And because that causes a lot of distortion on the blades, it changes the shape of the blades effectively. And so instead of two nice smooth flat surfaces gliding across each other, you have an edge pushed up. The edge is folded up like a scraper blade, and that scrapes across the neighbouring blade and effectively scrapes into that surface. And I think that's what I've normally attributed it to, is distortion of the blades. These blades were not oily, but they may have been in the past. The camera's got a bit of an unknown history. We know it's been serviced once or twice, to the extent that someone had the leatherettes off the bottom completely on one occasion and partially on another. So it's anyone's guess how often the shutter's been serviced. Alright, well those blades are all in position. Now here's our moving plate. Got to get that in position. Fortunately, I know from experience it goes right there. And then the shutter case goes on. This only goes on in one direction. As I said earlier, there's a little rivet on here, a dowel that locates this, so it can only go in one position. Let's give that a wriggle to seat it. Flip this over, put that underneath and fit the 3 retaining screws. I'll just do these screws up lightly at first, and I'll check to make sure that the blades are all seated correctly still, that I haven't knocked anything out of place. And assuming everything's in place, I'll go back and tighten these screws up. Okay, off with that. Let's have a look. All the pins are in there. Here, that opens and closes nicely. Those blades are not pretty, but as I say, that's Those marks are where the black finish is gone, and of course there's no point polishing it till more of the black finish is gone. So those marks that you see there, that's not oil on the blades, that's just the shiny surface of the blades where the black finish is rubbed away. Okay, so that's our shutter case and diaphragm, all good. That moves smoothly. If there'd been any stiffness there, I'd put a bit of graphite powder in here and work it, because most likely the stiffness would be between the moving plate and the case. But I think that's probably going to be fine. Alright, to assemble the mechanism plate, first I'll get the blade actuating ring back in place. This detent spring needs to be hooked behind that pin on the ring. I can tell this is an early shutter. That's a lighter gauge of spring than was used on later shutters. And put the retainer in place, or the lens tube in this case. The lens tube only goes on in one direction. One of these posts has got its edge chewed off to allow it to butt up against that pin, and that position is where that bracket goes. That bracket holds the main spring. The longer of our 3 screws goes through here. If you put a short screw there, effectively it'll be only about halfway through that aluminium plate when you're doing the screw up, which means that the normal torque that you'd put on that screw to tighten it up will likely strip the thread, and that's exactly what happens. So it's important that the screws go the full depth through the aluminium plate. And of course, if you do swap them over, you'll have a long screw where the short screw should be. It'll be sticking out the base plate here under the mechanism plate, and that will catch on shutter blades and ensure that the shutter doesn't work. Okay, so that's assembled. Now I'm going to lubricate this with some graphite powder. I could have lubricated that with molybdenum paste. Originally it would have been lubricated with graphite grease possibly. That detent spring there doesn't do an awful lot on this shutter, I can tell you. It was only a light spring at that stage. There's no problem with that. Just because they changed something doesn't mean it was necessarily a failure to start off with. It's just they found other ways to do things. So some graphite powder here, I think. So I've got some here. And if I work that blade actuating ring backwards and forwards, that'll see that graphite powder gets between the working surfaces. And of course these various levers and things want to drop in and stop the action from working here. Which one is it today? That one. There's 3 different levers that can drop in here, swing in and block the action. And they're all taking turns at it. That'll do anyway. I'll blow out that excess powder now and then assemble the shutter blades, put the case on there, and that'll be the shutter cased. First I want to swing the blade actuating ring into the blade's open position, which is there. Let's get that, wipe off that excess graphite powder that's still sitting on the surface, and put the shutter blades in position. With 5 blades, they're all identical, and there is a first and last position. There's our first, second, third, fourth, and the 5th blade. I need to put the case over the top. It only goes on in one position, and I'm just lining it up there. That should be correct. It's held on with 3 screws. I'll do these screws up rather lightly until I've checked that the shutter blades are still correctly positioned, that nothing hopped off its post while I was moving things about. That's fine. So I can do those 3 screws up. And that's our shutter blades and diaphragm blades back in the body, all nice and clean, all moving freely. So that's what we want there, and I can start putting the rest of this thing together. Well, I start with the springs. Springs are always entertaining because they always want to take off. I'll start with that spring. I'll hold the toothpick over the centre of the post here so the spring can't get away. Lift the tail of the spring up, swing it across, and hook it behind the other lever. No, that was the intention. That's not what happened. Let's do it again. This one is really reluctant to go where it should go. You need a good pair of tweezers to do this. This pair is pretty good. Okay, so that lever is now sprung loaded. That lever is now sprung loaded. That's good. Now we want the return spring for our B lever, which is this one. Goes over this post, and there's a groove around the post that spring sits into. I'll swing that back there, just checking that's seated. And I can put the B lever in place, but to do that comfortably it's best with the shutter blades open. So I'll hold back that catch, push the blade actuating ring forward, and that brings it into the position where I can get the B lever in, and the B lever will then drop into position. I've got to pull this back against its return spring that we've just put in place. And drop the B lever on top of its post here. And that's held in place with a spring, a screw with a spring on it. this one, and this is a bit awkward to get into place. This spring looks a little bit out of shape too, so I'm going to check to see how it functions. It may be that that's not shaped well enough. It may have been altered by someone. We know someone's been in the shutter before, and they may have intentionally or unintentionally damaged that spring. I've got to check to make sure that it looks like it's too high. This tail of the spring here is too high. It looks like it'll catch on this detent spring in the case. If that's the case, it won't work correctly. I'll see if I can bend the tail of that spring down. It certainly catches on that detent. I think that's it. Let's see what happens. No, it's catching on there all right. I'll take that screw out and I'm going to straighten that spring up. Well, not exactly straighten it up, bend it up is probably a better description. I'm going to put it back where it came from. It's sort of kicked up and it should be flat or kicked down at the end. And it looks to have a bit of a sharp bend there, like someone had done that intentionally. Now I'll put this back in position. Let's see if it functions. With that spring catching like that being the wrong shape, what may have happened is that the self-timer may not have run down correctly in every case. It may have... Yeah, that's it. That's clearing nicely now. That's as it should be. So I'm not sure. Yeah, somebody may have done that intentionally. Why you do that, I'm not... Well, they must have had something that appealed to them as a reason. That's all we can really say about it. Now I need to start cleaning up some more pieces to put them back into the shutter.